Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. And I'm your host, Stephen Peinecker. And folks, I have my special guest, Brent Ashworth, back for another segment of Show and Tell, which is based on the book that he wrote, which is this beautiful hardcover, A Unique Journey Through History from the Life of Brent Ashworth. And so you know, folks, this will eventually hopefully get into a paperback format. So keep that in mind, be aware of that. And so that you'll be able to purchase this fantastic book. So basically,
Yeah.
welcome back.
Hey, thank you. I need to mention that Tracy Felstead was the writer of the book.
Oh, thank you.
I helped her with it, but she was the writer of the book, and she did a great job. So.
Appreciate you. Yeah, props to the author. Very good. Thanks for bringing that up, Brent. So basically, we are just going to be doing another segment where Brent is going to reveal something to me for the first time. I have no idea what he's going to be throwing in front of the camera, and then I just react to it and see if he can keep me on my toes. So, Brent, what is our next item?
Well, this item is in the book, Show and Tell.
Okay.
People have often asked me if I have a favorite item in the collection. I have a couple of them, but this one is my favorite LDS piece. It's a full handwritten page by the prophet Joseph Smith on the subject of virtue. And we've got a full page of it in the book describing it. What's interesting about it is Dean Jesse, who you may know, started the Joseph Smith Papers Project way back when. Used to tell me years ago, he said, you know, Brent, when I first showed him this, he said, out of about 5,000 pages we have authored by the prophet Joseph Smith, if you discount that one little journal he kept for a short time, there's less than 50 of those pages in his handwriting. And that's really true. Anybody that collects Joseph Smith handwriting knows that there's very little around. This is one of the only pieces I'm aware of in private hands. And that's not the important thing. The important part of it is that Joseph wrote this at a time right after he got out of Liberty Jail. And you may recall the Great Revelations, section 121, 122, 123. In the 121st section of the DNC, one of the Lord's statements through Joseph is that we should garnish our thoughts with virtue. So the statement of virtue was on his mind when he was released. The Lord had given him that revelation there, along with the others. And when he made his escape, I should say, from Liberty Jail later, one of the assignments that he was given by the Lord by revelation was to take their grievances to the judge again over their Missouri loss of their property in Missouri. He says, and if the judge won't listen to you, take it to the governor. Well, obviously the governor had issued an exterminating order, Boggs, so he couldn't take it to him. He's not going to do anything. You Mormons ought to be exterminated or driven from the state, he said. And if that doesn't work, take it back to the national government. You know, it's mentioned in the Constitution, to the president and the Congress. Well, Joseph went through all of those steps, and the Lord said, if none of them will listen to you, I'll pour out my judgment upon them. Well, a lot of people in the church feel like that pouring of judgment on them was the Civil War, which happened a few years later and was the subject of a Revelation on the War, section 86. Anyway, Joseph gets out of the jail. He makes a trip back to Washington, D.C. to talk to President Van Buren, famous visit. He takes Judge Higbee with him. They took Porter Rockwell and Sidney Rigdon and Hiram Smith. Sidney got ill, and Porter took him and Hiram back to Commerce or Nauvoo, became at that time. Judge Higbee and Joseph went on. They visited with Van Buren, who told them, your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you. Kind of a unique idea. If I have to, I can do nothing for you. If I'd have to help the whole state of Missouri, which would be a unique idea for any politician, I guess. Anyway, he was rebuffed by the Congress too, and he, rather than make the trip a loser, he decided to go to Philadelphia, where the church had a small branch under Benjamin Winchester, it's the local branch president. And Joseph stayed on this trip for about a month. In fact, there's been some speculation that he might have had that famous photograph taken there that's never been found. But anyway, he was there long enough because he stayed with a Susan Conrad, who had a bed and breakfast there in Philadelphia, and he and Judge Higbee stayed at her place. And we know that the prophet, they rented a hall. It was actually a Jewish synagogue to speak from. Years ago, the church historical department found out that that synagogue was still standing, and they named it. There was room for several hundred people to crowd into the synagogue. The Philadelphia Inquirer, which I think is still the newspaper there, unless it went under, announced, "Come listen to the Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, the barbarian of the West." That's the way they described him. And out of curiosity, hundreds of people came to the synagogue to listen to Joseph Smith speak. Now, we don't know exactly what he said, but we do know from Winchester's notes and others that were there that it was pretty much a talk about family. I don't think it would be too foreign to say that it could be used in a present general conference of the church. Looking at it from perhaps a more eternal perspective, I would say that the Lord has is kind of Johnny One Note in a way, because he's trying to get families to work together. Joseph said as he came into Philadelphia, he knows the bars were filled with men who probably should be home with their wives and children. He saw children running around the streets of Philadelphia and not really cared for, their clothing tattered and so on. And he spoke about these issues from the pulpit there and said that mothers, fathers, get home, start raising your kids the way they should be raised, teaching them principles of truth and so on. And the talk was so well received that a number of people came up afterwards and asked to be baptized, including the lady they were staying with, Susan Conrad. She was eventually baptized too after that. It really kicked off the church in Philadelphia more than any other meeting that they'd had before. And a number of people were baptized, and the branch grew. Well, he was there about a month, like I say, and when he and Judge Higbee were getting ready to leave, Mrs. Conrad, not yet married, she later married a Wilkinson, she asked him if he wouldn't mind writing in her album. She had an autograph album. And he said he would. Now, generally, Joseph Smith used scribes for everything. In 1839, in his history, he says, "I hardly ever take up the pen myself." And any collector would agree with that. You can find things he signed, but even some of those are questionable. But full handwritten items are slim to nil. And when I showed this to Dean Jesse, he was amazed by it. It is in Joseph Smith's handwriting. And it's a full statement on virtue. And he'd had that on his mind since he got out of Liberty Jail a short time before. This is spring of 1840. It's not dated, but we think it's around February of 1840. Been there about a month. And this is what he wrote in her book. "Virtue is one of the most prominent principles that enables us to have confidence in approaching our Father who is in heaven in order to ask wisdom at his hand. Therefore, if thou wilt cherish this principle in thine heart, thou mayest ask with all confidence before him, and it shall be poured out upon thine head, and thou shalt not lack anything that thy soul desires in truth. And again, the Lord shall bless this house, and none of them shall fail, because they turn not away the servants of the Lord from their doors. Even so, amen." And he signed it Joseph Smith Jr. Now, I can feel the inspiration in that statement just by rereading it. And so to me, it's just a further testimony as to the prophetic calling of Joseph Smith. And the nice thing about it is it's entirely in his handwriting. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah.
You're at the bottom there. Joseph Smith Jr. His father was still alive for a few more months. He dropped the junior after his father died. But it's entirely in his handwriting, which makes it a rare piece. It's also my wife's and my favorite piece in the LDS collection. And Mrs. Wilkinson, she married Wilkinson later. It was Conrad at that time. I don't know if this is any easier to look at the copy, but that's the copy of it. And it's pictured a full page in my book. But It has no punctuation in it, much like the Book of Mormon manuscript. It has no punctuation in it. It has three distinct pieces, if you will. If you will, he has a statement on virtue, and then he gets scriptural, "Lead thy, thou," and so on, thine, and then he leaves the family with a blessing because it allowed him to stay with them. Three distinct parts, no punctuation anywhere, in it. So it's kind of interesting that way. It's precious to us now, but that has become my favorite autograph in the LDS collection.
Interesting. You wonder, you got something written in Joseph's handwriting, why the church hasn't canonized that.
Well, it's an important piece. It's going to make the Joseph Smith Papers project, of course,
Mhm.
but it's had an interesting history
Well, talk
because,
about it.
well, what happened was originally I found this piece. A good friend of mine, Pete Crawley, who's a very well-known book dealer and actually wrote the book on Mormon printing materials years ago. He serves as a missionary at the LDS Church Historical Office. It's a neighbor of mine for many years, a good friend. At any rate, he told me back in about 1973, he said, "Great, if you get down uh, to Laguna Beach, California, go look up my friend at the uh, at the bookstore there in Laguna Beach." And he gave me his name and all that. And I did. And I had my younger brother, who's an attorney like me, but he's in California, go with me. And his name was John Swingle, the dealer. And we went to his office. I told him I was interested in LDS things. He said, "Oh, I've got a marvelous piece. It's up at my house, though." So he invited us up to his home. So my brother and I that evening went up to his home. He had a full handwritten Lincoln piece. I've always been interested in Lincoln, but the piece was not signed by Lincoln, but obviously it was in his handwriting. It was a court brief. But then he pulls this piece out that I've read you, and I couldn't believe it. I was floored because it appeared to all be in Joseph Smith's handwriting. And it's a statement on virtue, and it had a great history to it. Well, I wanted this piece. It was more money than I can afford, $10,000 at the time, in 1973. And I was still in law school. My brother was about to go to law school, or just starting. And so didn't have the funds for it, but it's one of those things I really want to bet. So I tracked it. And it went from here to from John Swingle's store to in Laguna Beach to ultimately to Chicago. Ken Nebenzahl, map dealer that had it in Chicago for a while. The price kept going up. It kept getting out of reach. Eventually, a few years later, it ended up at the biggest autograph shop in the country, Charles Hamilton in New York. And Bud, as we called Charles, became a good friend, but he'd already gotten rid of it. I
Hmm.
moved it on to another friend of mine, Ken Rendell, who was actually involved with the Hoffman thing later. But Rendell has a World War II museum. He's a first-rate dealer, still living. He's been a friend since 1972. I've known him for a long, long time. And at any rate, Ken had it. Well, in 1985, I went to the New York Book Fair, which was held on at the 67th Avenue uh, Antique Convention Center, where they hold a lot of their conventions and things on Fifth Avenue in New York. And they had about 300 dealers there. Ken Rendell was there at the time. He had his dealership represented by a booth, and he saw me. And Mark Hofmann was there too at that time, and he was there with Galen Rust, Rust Coins, and a couple other people from the LDS Church Historical Department were also there at the time. So there were several of us that knew each other. At any rate, Ken and I were old friends, and Ken says, "I've got something I need to ask you your help on." And I says, "Oh, yeah?" And he says, "Yeah, can we go talk?" He says, "I don't want Hoffman to hear me." So at any rate, we went up to the men's room because the only place we thought we could talk. And while we're there at the men's room, he tells me, he says, I sent to Mark Hoffman a piece of papyrus, and it was genuine. It was from the Ptolemaic period of Cleopatra. And he said, I think it was $12,500 for this fragment. And he said, I haven't been able to get paid by the guy. He says, I know he's here, but he just kind of blows me off. He says, can you try to get my money for me or get my manuscript fragment back? And I says, you bet, Ken, I'll be trying to do that. And then he changes the subject. He says, oh, by the way, he has this Joseph Smith statement on virtue I sent him. And I knew exactly what it was because I'd tracked this thing for the previous dozen years or so. And this was 1985. And I completely forgot about the papyrus. I mean, talking about one of my favorite pieces I hadn't gotten, And he said, I sent that on to Hofmann too, and he hasn't paid me for it. He told me I think it was 25 grand or something by that time. And he said, I haven't been able to pay for it. Well, I completely forgot about the papyrus, which was probably a good thing at the time because it was the papyrus that ended up in Steve Christensen's safe deposit box after he was murdered. But and it had been offered to me. I'd had it. He and Flynn had brought it by my store a week or so before the bombings. But I completely forgot about it when he brings up this Joseph Smith piece, which I've been tracking for a dozen years. So I said, well, you mind if I go get it from Hofmann and send you a check? He says, no, that'd be great. I had a pretty good job by this time. So I decided, well, whatever it takes, I'm going to buy it. So when I told Hofmann, I says, well, I want that piece. I'm going to buy it. So he gave it to me. He didn't have the funds for it. And that's how I ended up with it. And for many years, the church wouldn't touch it because it had been touched by Hofmann. But it had nothing to do with Hofmann. And so I went and got Ken Riddell to write a long statement about its history and some of the other dealers along the way. And I know its provenance going way back. So the point is that we knew it was genuine, but the church wanted to handle it because Hofmann was in the chain. So for a long time, now they're going to include it finally in the Joseph Smith Papers project. But at any rate, that's a kind of a shortened version of the story. It was a long story, but it's an interesting story of how it came my way.
Wow, that is really very interesting to hear that. So yeah, this virtue letter, this wasn't known like very well. This wasn't a known thing. This is something that was like, when did we first hear about it? You may have mentioned it earlier, but I don't remember.
1973 was the first.
1973 is the first time you heard of it. And that was the first time that people knew about it?
Well, it was people generally didn't know about it for years after that. But
Got it.
my friend Pete Crawley told me about it, so he knew about it. John Swingle, who had gotten it originally, knew about it. It had been passed down through the family of Susan Conrad, and so we knew. Even though her name doesn't appear on it, we knew exactly where it came from. And then ultimately, years later, after I acquired it, the church ended up with the Conrad autograph album. And this is one of the pages missing out of it. And so about a year and a half ago during the pandemic, after we started, church historical staff invited me to bring it up again, look at it. We tried to get it in we got it in the church news when I first got it, but after Hofmann, they wouldn't touch it. And we were going to do an article for the Ensign, and they backed off on it because of the Hofmann connection, which it really didn't have, because Hofmann only had it in his hands for a short time. But at any rate, we were able this last go around to take this up, and I got another page since then from the same album, which was never put in the album or taken out. Exact same paper, exact same size and everything from a completely different source. It came at auction in Swan Galleries in New York. And it was a collection of LDS stuff. And among it was a handwritten statement of Sidney Rigdon's when he'd finally gotten to her place about a month later. And it was there right at the tail end of Joseph's visit. And Rigdon had written out an entire paragraph also for Conrad and had her name and everything on it. And identical paper. And so it fit perfectly in the album, but the album was bound without either of these pieces in it, or it had been rebound and they, when they were out of it. We don't know exactly for sure. But the other piece, the Sidney Rigdon piece, helped to further authenticate the Joseph Smith piece. So it was fun to have that come my way as well.
And that one didn't pass through the hands of Hofmann, right?
No.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's great. That's great to know. So very interesting. Like we had talked before, is just the history of the provenance of the item is so important, and of course the taint of Mark Hofmann will be with us for a very long time. This is really interesting item that you presented to my audience. I just wanted to ask you. First of all, thanks again for doing this segment with me. Do you have any final words you'd like to share with my audience?
Well, just that I think that this being a handwritten piece and where it really speaks to, I think his being close to the spirit, even in
Mm,
writing a short piece like this, you can feel, um, you can feel the spiritual nature of it. I think, and you don't get a lot of that um, with pieces that are not in his handwriting, that don't have this direct link to him. So it's a little visit with the prophet, if you will, I think, and that's what my wife and I really love about it.
that's a very good point. And I've actually even heard some letters that he had written to Emma from New York, and
Yeah.
how he was kind of grieving over the people of the city, like he had a burden for their souls, which I
Mhm.
found very interesting, that he felt that way in his own personal views, and that none of that stuff is for public consumption. So I think it's really good that we kind of get an idea of the inner workings and the thought process of who Joseph Smith was.
Yeah, I do
So.
too.
Well, once again, folks, I want to thank Brent for doing this show and tell segment. This is great. We're really enjoying the opportunity for Brent to share pieces of his collection that are regarded, that are connected with the restoration and the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I want to just remind everybody to like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the notification button to be informed when a new episode comes out. Brent, thanks for coming back on.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it.
We'll see you all later.